Remember when trucking used to be America's backbone? When a guy with a high school diploma could jump behind the wheel, make a decent living, and actually build something. Yep. Well, those days are circling the drain. And what's happening in the freight market right now should terrify you, because this is not just about truckers. This is about your grocery bill, your Amazon package, and the entire supply chain that keeps this country running. Let's talk about the third quarter freight numbers that just dropped, because they're telling us a story Washington does not want you to hear. According to the latest US Bank Freight Payment Index, national shipment volumes fell almost 3% compared to the second quarter. Meanwhile, and here's where it gets interesting, shipper spending increased by 2%. Translation: companies are moving less freight, but paying more to do it. That's not how supply and demand is supposed to work. But wait, it gets better. Year over year, shipments are down over 10%. The spending drop has not kept pace either, down less than 2%. So we've got this bizarre paradox where freight volumes are collapsing while rates stay stubbornly high. And the reason? Carriers are exiting the market faster than rats leaving a sinking ship. We're not talking about a few companies here and there. We're watching the systematic destruction of an entire industry's capacity. Over 50,000 trucking businesses have gone under during this freight recession. 50,000. Now, the establishment economists want to blame this on manufacturing slowdowns and consumer spending tightening. Sure, those are factors, but let's talk about what's really killing the freight market: tariffs. These brilliant trade policies that were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America are instead choking domestic factories. Here's why. Almost half of what we import are unfinished goods vital for manufacturing. So when you slap tariffs on intermediate materials, you're not just taxing Chinese finished products. You're making it more expensive for American manufacturers to produce anything at all. And these aren't theoretical tariffs we're discussing. The Trump administration implemented 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico in early 2025, then pulled them back, then reimposed them, creating the kind of policy whiplash that makes long-term business planning impossible. Mexico and Canada are our two largest trading partners. Trucks move 85% of goods that cross our southern border and 67% that cross our northern border. 100,000 full-time truckers depend on this cross-border freight. These tariffs could increase the price of a new truck by up to $35,000, putting new equipment completely out of reach for small carriers. Let me give you the real numbers on what this means. Industry analysts are predicting that import cargo volume at major container ports could see a net decline of 15% or more in 2025. The Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach handle roughly 50% of freight from China. That trade is already softening, and intermodal carriers are watching their business evaporate. Meanwhile, long-haul truckload demand has collapsed, down 25% year over year by early 2025 as more freight shifts to cheaper rail options. But here's what should really keep you up at night. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration says the number of motor carriers with operating authority dropped to about 339,000 in 2024. That's 13,000 fewer carriers, a nearly 4% decline. And get this, the industry is still dealing with excess capacity from the pandemic boom. During COVID, the spot market went insane, and thousands of new carriers flooded in thinking they hit the jackpot. Well, the hangover has been brutal. About 480,000 carriers joined since June 2020, and only 18% are still active. Let that sink in. 82% failed. The survivors? They're bleeding out slowly. Operating costs are 20% higher for new carriers than established ones because insurance and financing costs have gone through the roof. Meanwhile, spot rates, which small carriers depend on, have been getting decimated. One industry analyst put it perfectly. Small carriers have been taking a bath for years now, but even the big guys are hurting. FedEx announced the tariff situation would cost them $170 million in a single quarter. When the number one carrier on the fleet owner 500 list is taking those kinds of hits, you know the damage runs deeper. And the regional breakdown? It's a tale of winners and losers that reads like economic warfare. The Northeast and West regions showed some growth. The Northeast saw shipments up over 6% year over year, with spending up nearly 12%. Why? Manufacturing activity and strategic moves by shippers importing goods early to avoid tariffs. The Port of Los Angeles processed 2 million containers in July and August alone. But flip over to the Southwest and it's an absolute bloodbath. Freight levels dropped over 32% compared to the third quarter of 2024. The Southeast hasn't experienced a year-over-year increase in shipments since third quarter of 2021. That's almost 4 years of continuous decline. The Midwest, it's the only region reporting declines in both shipments and spending. Volumes down over 11% year over year. Spending over 6%. Flat consumer spending and reduced cross-border freight with Canada are gutting the heartland's trucking economy. Now, here's where the regulatory hammer comes down to make everything worse. Since June 25th, the Department of Transportation has been enforcing English language proficiency rules more strictly. Between late June and September, more than 5,000 drivers nationwide were deemed out of service for violations. The policy hit the Southwest particularly hard, the same region already drowning in freight volume declines. So you've got freight disappearing, costs rising, and now you're pulling drivers off the road for language issues. Brilliant policy coordination, right? But the establishment narrative wants you to believe this is just a normal market correction. They call it a prolonged slump, or use cute phrases like a severe hangover from the extraordinarily strong freight market. No, this is 13 straight quarters of weak demand. 13 quarters. That's unprecedented. The Great Recession saw freight tonnage decline by 24%, but it was sharp and relatively short. This one's been a slow grind down 8 to 9%, like someone slowly turning a screw into the industry's skull. And what's the policy response? More tariffs, more uncertainty, more regulatory burdens. The Section 232 tariffs on imported trucks and components took effect November 1st, adding even more pressure. The EPA 2027 emissions standards loom on the horizon. creating additional compliance costs that carriers can't pass along because rates are already depressed. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Here's the part that should make you angry. While carriers are going bankrupt by the thousands, while drivers are struggling to make ends meet, private fleets, the in-house trucking operations owned by big shippers like Walmart, are capturing more and more market share. They've got contractual stability and operational scale that small for-hire carriers can't match. During the pandemic, more shippers built out their private fleets to avoid rate volatility. When demand tapered off, that incremental capacity absorbed freight that would have gone to the for-hire market, prolonging this entire nightmare. So what happens next? The optimists say we're close to equilibrium, that capacity and demand are finally balancing out. Some analysts predict spot rates have bottomed out and will start climbing. They point to the fact that capacity is finally contracting meaningfully. Class 8 tractor orders were down over 42% year over year in the second quarter. Used truck sales remain active as fleets right-size, but pricing reflects a saturated resale market. But here's what they're not telling you. Any recovery depends entirely on freight demand increasing or capacity exiting fast enough to create tightness. With tariff uncertainty continuing, manufacturing indicators showing little growth, and consumer spending shifting away from goods toward experiences, where exactly is this demand surge supposed to come from? The freight market needs a catalyst, and right now the policy environment is providing nothing but headwinds. Some carriers are on the cusp of failing even if the market improves. Cash reserves built up during pandemic boom are gone. Fleets have deferred maintenance to survive, which means they'll face breakdowns and high repair costs just as demand potentially recovers. Many small carriers have trucks they can't make payments on, but lenders have held off repossessing vehicles. When those lenders finally pull the trigger, it'll create another wave of bankruptcies. The tariff situation could extend this freight recession into 2026. That's not speculation. That's what ACT Research is forecasting. The longer tariffs remain in place, the more permanent the damage becomes. Supply chains that reroute around tariffs don't just snap back when policy changes. Shippers find new suppliers, establish new relationships, build new networks. The freight lanes that sustained American trucking for decades could be permanently altered. And let's talk about what this means for you, the consumer. When trucking capacity shrinks and the survivors have pricing power, guess who pays? Trucking moves 72% of America's freight by weight, 11 billion tons annually. Your food, your clothes, your furniture, your electronics, all of it depends on trucks. When carrier costs rise and capacity tightens, those costs get passed down. The inflation you've been feeling, transportation costs are baked into literally everything. This isn't just about an industry in trouble. This is about the fundamental infrastructure that makes modern American life possible. When trucking fractures, the entire economy feels it. Jobs disappear not just for drivers, but for dispatchers, mechanics, warehouse workers, and everyone else in the logistics chain. Rural communities that depend on trucking employment get hollowed out. The American dream of earning a solid middle-class living without a college degree, the dream that trucking represented for generations, gets pushed further out of reach. So, while politicians argue about tariff strategy, and trade policy, while economists debate market corrections and capacity rebalancing, thousands of trucking companies are quietly closing their doors. Drivers are walking away from a career that once provided dignity and decent pay, and the surviving carriers are barely hanging on, praying that demand recovers before their cash runs out. The third quarter freight numbers are just the latest chapter in a story that's been playing out for over 3 years. Volumes falling, costs rising, capacity exiting, and policy making everything worse. The freight recession everyone said would be over by now keeps grinding along quarter after quarter. And unless something fundamentally changes, unless we get serious policy reform that addresses the tariff chaos, the regulatory burden, and the structural problems choking this industry, there is no reason to believe 2026 will be any different. This is what economic warfare looks like when it's waged through incompetent trade policy and regulatory overreach. The casualties are American trucking companies and the families that depend on them. The cost is measured in closed businesses, lost jobs, and a weaker supply chain. And the responsibility lies with policymakers who treat the trucking industry like a political football instead of the critical infrastructure it actually is. So, the next time someone tells you the economy is doing great, remember these numbers. Remember the 50,000 businesses that failed. Remember the 13 consecutive quarters of decline. Remember the 100,000 truckers whose livelihoods depend on cross-border freight being destroyed by tariff volatility. Because this freight recession isn't just statistics on a report. It's families losing everything they built, and it's a warning about what happens when policy disconnects completely from reality. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an update. Your support lets me keep bringing you more content just like this. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.